Thousands are protesting against Hamas in Gaza. Is peace about to break out in the Middle East? What about Ukraine, where a new ceasefire was agreed this week? Germany's new parliament began sitting this week. Will it have the strength that it needs to make real changes? And sadly, we weren't included on the Trump administration's group chat on what to do about the Houthis in Yemen, but we can still discuss that and what it means for the world on today's Trumpet World. There are several critical developments that I want to cover from Europe this week, all leading speedily to the rise of a European superstate. The German parliament took its seats this week. A whiff of 1932 was how Euro intelligence covered it. The article talked about just how many seats the far-right Alternative for Deutschland has in the German parliament and just what a big presence they have in that room. They write that 1932, with the Nazis not in government yet, was the moment when they started to wreak havoc with parliamentary procedures. And the Alternative for Deutschland is seeing their popularity rise. This incoming coalition government, they haven't gotten their coalition agreement together yet, but they're really struggling and they are already losing a lot of popularity. The Christian Democrats have basically been taken to the cleaners. The Social Democrats did terribly in the election. However, the coalition arithmetic means that they're one of the best options for the Christian Democratic Union as a coalition partner. The leader of the Christian Democrats has said, we're not going to do a coalition with the AfD and we're not going to do a minority government, which leaves the Social Democrats as his only option. And they know it. That means that they have been making all kinds of pretty outrageous demands in these coalition negotiations, safe in the knowledge that the right-wing Christian Democrats won't walk away. The result of that is people abandoning already the Christian Democrats and moving towards the Alternative for Deutschland. This incoming coalition government is already committed to borrowing a lot of money. Yes, on the military, which is broadly popular, but also on infrastructure, environmental spending. These are things that the Christian Democratic Union campaigned against. Like, not borrowing lots of money was a core part of their campaign strategy. There are also some reports that indicate that there might be a relatively tough migrant restrictions. The Christian Democratic Union has got its way somewhat there, but I don't think that's going to be enough for a lot of people. A few weeks ago, Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry had a Key of David program called Germany is Seeking a New Charlemagne. And so much of the news this week from Europe ties into that Key of David program. And I'd really encourage you to go and watch it. They're only just over 20 minutes long if you haven't seen that, because that is your guide to what all of the news in Europe means this week. But he had a little bit where he talked about the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party in that video.
They have a party now in Germany. I think they have about 17% of the vote. The AfD party, which is really the neo-Nazis or new Nazis, and Elon Musk is encouraging them to keep growing. But he doesn't understand Bible prophecy, or I don't think he would be making such a statement. That's something we need to think about.
And this is what we're seeing already this week. The AfD party surging in popularity. And it seems if this coalition agreements and negotiations is anything to go by, we're just going to see them soar to new heights as this neo-Nazi spirit rises in Germany. And talking of that title of the Key of David program, Germany is Seeking a New Charlemagne, this vision for a new Holy Roman Empire lacks a Charlemagne. That is a quote from Jonathan Turley, a mainstream journalist, talking about what is happening right now in Europe. He says they're building a Holy Roman Empire, they just don't have a Charlemagne yet. And that is exactly what Mr. Flurry was talking about on that Key of David program. He was talking about the New World Order with European Values, a summit that was held in Berlin by the World Forum this week. And this was all about a global shift away from American ideals towards European ideals. And as Turley talked about in that article, well, American ideals are a much more genuine commitment to free speech, whereas European leaders will call what they want, free speech, but it's free speech for people I agree with, or people that I disagree with, but not too much. It's like free speech within a prescribed, fairly narrow spectrum of ideas. And if you fall outside of that spectrum, we want the right to censor you. This is what they're talking about spreading around the world. And they want, say, criminal prosecution around the world for those that have toxic ideologies. And to Mr. Tully's credit, he sees that this is about building a new Holy Roman Empire. And again, going back to this key of David, this is exactly what Mr. Flurry was talking about. Here's another clip from towards the beginning of that.
Europe is seeking this new Charlemagne. That's what they want to lead. After many years, they've had to have weaker leadership. Now, Charlemagne was leader of the Holy Roman Empire beginning in 800 AD. He was a hero of Adolf Hitler, and that caused a lot of problems in our past. Germany, though, has had this weak leadership, and they really need strong leadership in Europe, especially when you look at what's happening in Russia and China and North Korea and many problems. But they are desperate, I mean, just really desperate for a Charlemagne. And they're going to have to realize that there is a great danger in that. And in many ways, the Holy Roman Empire is going to be hijacked. And that's not going to be good news.
That Holy Roman Empire is under construction. And they're just looking for that new Charlemagne. And you see that on the European level. You see that increasingly even on the German level, where they've had an election, and German voters still feel like this election hasn't given them what they wanted. That they're just getting more of the same, that the power that they kind of kicked out of office with its worst result in history is still calling the shots. They want some big changes, and they're going to see, well, we need to get a strong man in charge to fix that. So you're going to have Germany, or you're already having Germany wanting a Charlemagne, Europe wanting a Charlemagne. This is where everything is heading. And I think another story that ties in this week to Europe's desire for a Charlemagne is coming from this big push for emergency preparedness. So just over a week ago, France announced they're going to send everybody a little brochure on preparing for emergencies. And this is going to have all of the phone numbers that you need in an emergency, all of the radio stations that will be broadcasting emergency information, tips on how to survive a nuclear attack, kind of duck and cover, close the doors and windows, all of that kind of thing, instructions on assembling a 3-day emergency bag. European Union this week came out and said, hey, yeah, we want all citizens of the EU to have a kind of a 3-day emergency kit. So we want 6 liters of water per person on hand, tinned food, a torch, radio, spare batteries, a printed emergency plan of what you're going to do. And we want every household in Europe to have all of this. It's a bit of a coincidence, isn't it, that France is talking about an emergency plan, the EU talking about an emergency plan all at the same time. And these emergencies, they're kind of saying, well, it could be war, it could be a pandemic, it could be a cyber attack, it could be an earthquake. They're not massively specific, but quite clearly, this isn't all of Europe suddenly just kind of waking up and thinking, oh, we need to plan for earthquakes. There is a real and important agenda behind this. All of Europe, like we've been talking about a lot on this show, is gearing up for a big military spending spree. But really, only Germany has the money to be able to do that easily. Everyone else has just about maxed out their credit card. So military spending spree means cuts in other areas. And for France in particular, they're talking about, well, extending the French nuclear umbrella all over Europe. And that means probably a bigger French nuclear force, more French nuclear bombs. That's got to be paid for. Where's that money going to come from? And right now in France, like they're kind of having government after government unseated by issues surrounding cutting the pension age or raising the pension age. So the idea of having people work longer and retire when they're older so that we have more money to spend on our military, like that's a toxic debate in France right now. And I think the European leaders see they need to cultivate a climate of crisis in order to build that Holy Roman Empire that they're wanting. That's why you've got this new push for survivalism. And in saying this, I'm not saying, well, it's no danger, that the idea of a threat to Europe is a complete fabrication, because that's not true. I think just without this nudge, European citizens are still comfortable and pretty complacent, and they don't feel like sacrificing their benefits, investing a little less in their healthcare system, or working a bit longer, having smaller pension packages in exchange for a bigger military. They're not fearful enough to make those kind of sacrifices. And the French, I think, don't really fear Russian troops marching down the streets of Paris. I've even seen geopolitical futures talking about, well, if Russia failed to take Kyiv in 3 years, they're not that big of a threat. And I think that underestimates the threat from Russia. But I think that's absolutely a sentiment that's there in Western Europe. It's not there in Eastern Europe. I think in Eastern Europe, there is much more of a genuine threat. Lithuania sent out survival manuals to all of their people all the way back in 2016. Latvia published theirs out 5 years ago. They updated it last summer. Poland published a survival manual in 2022. Denmark sent one out digitally last summer. Finland and Sweden sent them out last November. Eastern Europe is on top of this already. Western Europe is now following suit. And all of this in Eastern Europe has been accompanied with some dramatic changes. I mean, since they sent out their survival manual, Poland has roughly doubled its armed forces. And just this week, there's been more news out of Poland, where Poland is getting prepared to train its entire male adult population for war. They are NATO's biggest defense spender as a proportion of their economy. But you can spend a lot on weapons. You need people to use them. They're working on more than doubling their manpower to have 500,000 troops, but they want to train 1 million of reservists. And they've said that by the end of the year, they want something in place so that every adult male in Poland is trained for war. Now, this training will be voluntary. It won't be conscription, but they still want to make that available. They want to make it available for women to opt into and volunteer into as well. I mean, these are big society-wide changes that are going on in Poland and other countries. I think the leaders of France and Western Europe want these same big society-wide changes. But the population isn't ready for that yet. And so they're working to cultivate a sense of crisis to get the military that they want. And so they're sending out all of these survival manuals, and they're trying to make this tangible. Hey, you need a survival pack of 3 days of food. And again, even in pointing this out, I'm not criticizing the idea of survival preparedness either. Depending on where you live, and it's probably a prudent and important precaution to have some things to get you by a few days in an emergency. I'm not criticizing them for that, but I'm pointing out there is a clear agenda to drive change in Europe by promoting a climate of crisis. And so all of these stories point to this rise of the Holy Roman Empire that we've talked about for years. In 1978, Mr. Armstrong wrote, "Europeans want their own united military power. They know that a political union of Europe would probably produce a third major world power as strong as either the United States or the USSR, possibly stronger." And Mr. Armstrong pointed to the fear of Europe in causing Europe to unite, and Europe's reluctance to rely on the United States. And I think, there is a genuine fear of Europe. There is a genuine fear of Russia in Europe. And yes, there are genuine fears about America's security being withdrawn. But for a lot of European leaders, this is something that they want to build anyway. And they're working to create that opportunity to have that Holy Roman Empire. He said in Mr. Armstrong in that article, "The United States is not loved in Europe." And that is absolutely true today. They want this military power so that they don't play second fiddle to the United States. And Europe, this is important to understand. Europe is not pushing for this rearmament because they want to be good, helpful European allies. It's not because they feel bad for freeloading on America's security and military spending for all of these decades. It's because they want to rival and challenge and bring down, ultimately, the United States. And these trends of Europe remilitarizing, the rise of this strongman, these all tie together. This is all part of this biblically prophesied transformation of Europe. Here's just another quote from Mr. Armstrong in a sermon where he was talking about what to expect for Europe ahead.
Now that's what we're expecting next over here in Europe, is that there will be a union of 10 nations going together in Europe, and the Pope at Rome will sit on top of the whole heap. There will be one man over all of the governments. There will be a king, or I don't know, they may call him a president, a prime minister, whatever term they give him, I don't know, over each one of the 10 nations.
So we've been talking for years about the rise of this strongman, this new Charlemagne. Now, as he pointed out there in that quote, we're expecting it to be a union of 10 nations. Right now, Europe is 27 nations. And yeah, there are some genuine struggles to kind of raise cash so that they can have more weapons. And the fact that we're going to see Europe transform from this kind of 27-nation economic union led by 3 different presidents and several different committees to 10 nations led by a strongman, yeah, there's going to be some upheaval. And they will have to make some of those changes before they can be this dominant superpower. But those changes will come fast. Mr. Armstrong always talked about how quickly we're going to see this rise. Those changes are absolutely moving fast already. And our latest Trumpet print edition, Up in Arms, has a lot of articles talking about this transformation to Europe. It has articles talking about Europe's sudden military rise, about how Germany is about to get this strongman, this Charlemagne, about how Europe, and most of all Germany, already dominates the Mediterranean Sea and how critical that is for the world. So you can get that on our website, thetrumpet.com. You can scroll down there. There's the Up in Arms Trumpet print. I also had a discussion with Philip Nice a few weeks ago where we talked about that Trumpet print edition. There are, of course, other important news stories that I wanted to talk about as well this week. Here's a clip from a different Key of David. The China-America clash is prophesied. It's about trade war with China. But as we get into some of the economic stories from Europe, it's an important story to see what's at stake for Europe.
Now, oftentimes you'll find that this trade war that's going on around the world, and especially between America and China, is really quite bad. And oftentimes in the past, trade wars led to shooting wars, just like in World War II. That's what happened. Now, we see that China is intimidating all the people in East Asia, and they probably preparing to cut the U.S. off from trade in that area, just as Japan did in World War II. And that, of course, a lot of that happened after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But there was a great trade war going on. But I'll tell you this, how can you trust a nation, a powerful superpower, when they lie and cheat and do everything deceitful that you can possibly imagine? Now, this is just news that's out there for anybody, and it's not anything that I'm telling you that's hidden, unless people are just not watching.
So trade wars can lead to hot wars, and the Bible has a lot to say about that happening, and about America losing a trade war that is ultimately, or almost the rest of the world, against the United States. That's important context to see Donald Trump announcing 25% tariffs on all foreign cars and auto parts this week. And he's indicated if anybody does anything about that, especially if Europe or Canada do anything about that, there will be more tariffs. And those tariffs could be 20% on top of that. So you could be looking at close to 50% tariffs on European cars. He's also been talking about tax credits, so that if you borrow money to buy a new American car, you can write that off against your taxes. Borrow money to buy a European car, you won't be able to do that. So a European car sold in the United States will now be, or could very soon be, substantially more expensive than the same car made in America. And again, I think there's a lot to sympathize here with this. I think it is important for America to keep manufacturing at home. And the shutdown, the decline of American manufacturing is a curse. And it means if America can't build things, if it can't build weapons, and ultimately in a time of war, that's disastrous for the nation. And really, it was America's industrial capacity, I mean, that played such a vital role in the Allies winning World War II. At the same time, though, I think to fix some of those problems, sometimes you have to look at the root causes of why this manufacturing is being shipped abroad. And I think absolutely some of that is it being taken advantage of by other nations. I mean, yeah, China can manufacture things more cheaply than the United States because they'll use slave labor to do it. And so, yeah, you do need to defend against that kind of thing. But some of what's happening as well is leading directly to trade war and is leading to Europe being placed in a very uncomfortable position. And this could be devastating for the German car industry. Some of these kind of tariffs could play a major role in Europe preparing for the economic warfare and the siege that the Bible talks about, and that Mr. Flurry has so many articles and Key of David programs that talk about Europe and China getting together and cutting America off from world trade. You can absolutely see these kind of measures leading to that outcome. And I think a critical point on this is one that Mr. Hilliker made back in January in his article, The Most Important Presidential Proclamation Trump Should Make. And in that article, he wrote, the tariffs Trump is touting could rectify trade imbalances and boost domestic manufacturing. In the short term, at least, they could make life more expensive for Americans, and they could accelerate the development of a prophesied mart of nations that bands together in economic alliance against America. So many of the president's directives are positive moves, yet there are no guarantees they will work. Too many factors are in play. The strength and size of the forces that oppose them are uncharted and fluctuating, and the ultimate outcome is unknowable. The threat of tariffs swiftly brought little Colombia into line and over-accepting deportees. At what point will a more powerful nation up the ante and elevate hostilities rather than caving in? He said, the fact illustrated by this trumpet issue of contrast is that America faces two pathways into the future: potential for sensational success and danger of catastrophic failure. And the determining factor in which of the two becomes reality is not Donald Trump. The determining factor is whether God is blessing the nation or cursing us. This is the critical factor. And so, I mean, I don't want this little segment to be an argument in favor of tariffs or an argument against them. I think they can be they're a tool of war, a tool of economic war. Sometimes you need them in self-defense, and sometimes using them is foolish. And really, what America needs to navigate this increasingly dangerous world is something that's not relying on a human mind to make those calls, but relying on God and his guidance and his protection. And this is a core message. This is why God has saved America through Donald Trump. It is not because he uniquely knows all of the right decisions and he's the one person who can come in there and make every call correct and right. Instead, it's God giving us a temporary respite from the forces that were actively destroying America and an opportunity to repent and turn to God for solutions. And if we don't do that, well, this European superpower is being raised up very quickly that is going to be used to correct Britain and the United States. And again, you can read more about that superpower in our Trumpet edition, Up in Arms. And that will give you the critical background that you need to understand what is happening here in Europe. Well, speaking of mistakes that the Trump administration has been making, a lot of the internet has been having fun at their expense after someone accidentally added an Atlantic journalist into a group chat about bombing the Houthis in Yemen. We'll learn more about what this needs by talking to Andrew Miller, our US correspondent.
Yeah, that's basically the scandal of the week here in America is the Signal group chat scandal, where you had several prominent U.S. leaders, including President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, on a group chat discussing foreign policy, and they must have had this left over from the Biden administration or something like that, because they actually had the Atlantic correspondent Jeffrey Goldberg on the group chat, who in the past administration was probably someone who was included on group chats like this, because the Atlantic basically is government media here in America. The media might be making a bigger deal out of it than it actually is. I think the most embarrassing revelation was Vice President J.D. Vance talking about how pathetic and freeloading the Europeans are for not really taking much of an active stance in Yemen or in the Red Sea, and that America's having to go in and secure this region. So that's definitely something that I think a lot of like America's European NATO partners are offended by. But on the other hand, what he said in the group chat wasn't much different from what he said at the Munich Security Conference or some other things where the European leaders were there, and he meant them to be listening. Well, there's a few people in Europe, especially in the defense contracting business, who are pretty anxious to step up and start defending themselves. But it's then also amongst the general population, though, there's a bit of resentment that, like, okay, well, we're going to step up and defend ourselves, but we're mad about it. we're mad at America for not doing it, for not doing what it used to. And so you're getting a rift on the both sides where you've actually got two developing independent military power blocks instead of an alliance that don't like each other very much.
And I think what it does do is it does confirm to Europe that this is not a negotiating posture, that when J.D. Vance goes to the Munich Security Conference and says, we're not going to pay for your security anymore, you need to pay, that he is not bluffing. And that he genuinely, like in this group chat, he was kind of like, I don't want to bomb the Houthis because it's Europe's problem. They're suffering more than we are, much more than we are from the closure of the Suez Canal. They should have to deal with it. I did prepare this bit of a clip from a message that Herbert W. Armstrong gave a few decades ago, where he talked about our reliance on Europe and our reliance on Japan as well. And he brings up and what the Bible says about that.
Now, and as we're going to find that Germany and Japan and Western or Central Europe at least are going to fail us, always making allies of other nations, always depending on them, relying on physical power and our own armed might, not relying on our God. We're playing a harlot when we should depend on God, when we should consider that we are married to Him. He's our husband, and a husband is the protector of the wife. And we are in the position of being the wife. Israel is married to God. We should rely on our Savior. He's our protector. He's our husband. But no, we make an alliance with other nations, and we rely on them. And we make lovers out of them instead of loving God. Thou shalt love the eternal thy God with all your mind and heart and soul and strength. That's the first and great commandment. We violate that as a nation. Now, I don't think we realize we're doing it. I don't think we do at all. I think we sincerely think. We've just kidded ourselves into thinking. We've been deceived into believing that we're really relying on God. But then, you know, we think that God is sort of a myth, and He's far off, and maybe He's not real, and maybe He couldn't really help us. So we must depend on something that is real. We must depend on something that we can see. And so now we're so afraid of Russia that the United States government feels that it must take what we call a calculated risk, you know, and try to build up Germany and Central Europe against Russia. All right, you'll see what we're building. And you're not going to have to wait more than 15 years to see it, and I don't think you'll wait that long.
As Mr. Armstrong said, the big deal here is we've been trusting in our foreign allies instead of trusting in God. And I mean, with statements like this from J.D. Vance, that's not fundamentally changing. We're telling our allies, like, yeah, stop free riding, but we still trust them. There's still this assumption behind everything that Vance and everyone else is saying that if Europe pays its fair share, they're still going to be on Britain and America's side. And that lovers relationship is still there. And so that, I think, is what makes this break so dangerous, is that Europe is breaking. Europe is turning against America. Meanwhile, Britain and America still trust Europe. And that is that lovers relationship that Herbert W. Armstrong talked about based on all of those Bible prophecies. And it's still that same root, that same heart of the problem, that we trust in foreign powers to keep us safe instead of turning to God. And a lot of these guys are dead right that America is in a financial crisis, that spending on doing all of this, like taking care of the Houthis. This is part of the reason why America has such a massive deficit. And that deficit is, as you've talked about, Andrew, a bit even recently, like one of the biggest, if not the biggest, national security threat to the United States. And so they're trying to solve that problem, but they're trying to solve that problem by looking for Europe, looking for Germany, looking to them to spend their money and take care of the problem. Whereas really the issue is about looking to God and going to him to take care of our problems, because this ballooning debt proves we can't in the long run take care of all of these problems ourselves.
On the surface, this definitely looks like Donald Trump is turning against America's lovers. And a lot of the rhetoric his administration is using is offending those lovers. Although in a different way, it is almost kind of an intensification of it, because if you go back to the post-World War II order, like Dwight D. Eisenhower's time, the agreement was that Germany and Japan, the Axis powers, would not militarize. They'd maintain very small militaries, and we'd defend them because we didn't trust them. We didn't trust Germany. We didn't trust Japan. They said, we'll defend you. We'll take care of you. But we don't actually have enough faith in you guys to let you defend yourselves because we feel like you might be our enemies. That really has gone out the window with the Trump administration. And he might have some good sound financial reasons for wanting it to be that way. But despite all the rhetoric about how they're freeloaders and they're pathetic and they need to pay their fair share, the underlying assumption here is that if we have a militarized Germany and a militarized Japan, we can trust them to at least defend themselves and not attack us, which Bible prophecy shows us is a bad assumption. We're putting trust in these countries that's unwarranted, and yeah, there's plenty of biblical precedent there. Actually, now in the modern world, you're so used to alliances and stuff like that. But usually, like if you read the Bible in ancient Israel, whenever a king tried to make a military alliance with Egypt or with Assyria, or a couple of them kind of switched back and forth a few times, God's prophets never had anything positive to say about that. And it's all, and in some cases, some of these kings, he even said, he said, okay, well, because you trusted them more than God, you're going to lose a great military victory. And some of those prophecies, some of those are history, and some of those are end time too. I've got one I brought with me today in Ezekiel 23. Sorry, not Ezekiel 23. Ezekiel 20. I'll just read verse 9 real quick, where it says, "Wherefore I have delivered her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, upon whom she doted." And this is a whole, actually rather graphic poem about using this allegory of Israel like a woman who's prostituted herself out to foreign lovers for protection and gifts and things like that. And then explains that the parable is about like America's the woman and Assyria or Germany is this man in the parable, saying that we've looked to Germany, saying that like, okay, well, we don't have the money or whatnot to continue being the world's policeman, so we want the European Union and some of these Asian powers to step it up and help us defend world peace in a way that shows that you're actually trusting them quite a bit more than trusting God.
And if we're not going to look to God and turn to him voluntarily, which is the only way that we can have peace and happiness and prosperity, well, then God is raising up this European power to correct us, even as we saw during the first half. And we'll talk a little bit more about another important story that relates to the rise of that European power going on in Ukraine with Jeremiah in just a moment. But before then, Andrew, did you want to just give us a rundown of the other significant pieces of news from the United States and the rest of the English-speaking world this week?
Yeah, well, in economic news, currency wars are definitely heating up. Actually, Donald Trump, as well as his son Donald Trump Jr., his son Eric, and his son Barron, all have a pretty good financial interest in a company called World Liberty Financial, which has just launched a new cryptocurrency venture, a stablecoin venture. A stablecoin is a cryptocurrency that's backed by a real currency. So this is a cryptocurrency that's backed by the U.S. dollars, that Trump and his family are pretty actively promoting as a way to allow dollars to be traded on the international market using blockchain technology, but while avoiding the Orwellian surveillance pitfalls that come along with a central bank digital currency. So there won't be he doesn't want like a Fed coin or a digital dollar, but wants a cryptocurrency that can be traded one-to-one with dollars so that America doesn't get left behind in the technology war for currency digitization. So Donald Trump's been actively promoting that, and the European Union thinks it could be very effective because many officials in the European Central Bank have said that Europe needs to like double its efforts to get a central bank digital currency, a digital euro, so that the euro can be traded digitally like these dollar-backed stable coins will be. So just another example of where you really see the world kind of dividing into two big economic blocks, America kind of leading this stablecoin technology, Europe and maybe even more so China at the moment, relying on central bank digital currencies in a move that I do plan on writing about sometime soon, because this could actually threaten the dollar's status as the reserve currency, not by replacing it, but by just eliminating the need for a reserve currency, making the digital transfer technology so efficient that you don't actually have to hold any currency in a reserve in a bank for financial transactions. The currency can just be instantaneously converted from one nation's currency to the other using this blockchain technology. And then one last little bit of, I guess, personal news I wanted to mention. I really want to thank the Trumpet Hour listeners around the world for all the nice letters I've gotten for talking about my house burning down last week. I think may go down as one of my most popular segments. I've gotten much more response than I normally do on that. And so I thought I'd just confirm for everyone who's curious that I'm pretty much in the same position I was last week, still on the air mattress in the lead up to the spring holy days. But we did have some good progress just getting things done this week to where it looks like actually God's probably intending this to just be an outright blessing. I sat down with the tenants, like I said, an investment property I have, and we're working out a deal where we can get them moved closer to their grandchildren, in a place that will be take care of all their needs, and then I'll be able to move back into the investment property, not have to deal with a lot of the hassles that come along with being a landlord, and just have a good place to live there. Actually, probably even a little bit nicer than the place that burnt down. It's kind of an old historic house in Guthrie, Oklahoma. It was actually used as a prop in the movie they made based off the book Ronald Reagan and the Fight Against Communism. Ronald Reagan's never been there, but it looks like the place where he grew up. So they asked if they could film. On the property. So if you've seen that movie, I'll give you a hint. There's a scene with like a 1950s football team in front of a blue house with white pillars. So that's the house I'll be moving into. And so a lot of good things happening there. I think the only negative comments I got were on the YouTube comment section, which is generally how that works. That's usually where most of the negative comments come through. People who've been so influenced by this communist infiltration of the U.S. and Canada that they're convinced that it's just always immoral for a landlord to evict tenants. And so when I mentioned on the program that I'm evicting tenants, that's the only thing I got any people who like write in there they say, well, that's not Christian to do that. So I thought I'd clarify that they were on a month-to-month contract. I've actually given them more than a month to find another place, worked with their family because they're elderly to get them a place that's going to be even more convenient for them, and gave them their security deposit back early. So I've definitely followed all God's economic laws and making sure that I honored my contract, I kept my word, I did fair business practices. We've got a plan in place. I'm doing fine. The tenants are doing fine, and there's nothing in the Bible that says that you have a moral obligation to rent out your property if you don't want to, as long as you've filled the financial contract I signed, which I have filled all the obligations in that.
I mean, I think I do understand some of where the critics were coming from. I think the big lesson really is don't judge a situation when you don't know all the facts, which I think is a lesson many of us, including us sometimes, that are putting out a message on the internet can take away. But I think coming from the UK, and I think Canada is the same, where the rental market is just almost totally dysfunctional. I can see how someone could kind of come to those conclusions. Like here in the UK, we had Mihailo was looking to rent a property recently, and he would like show up on the day that a property came on the market. He'd have a viewing booked, he'd view it and still not get it because there'd be like 20 people looking at it on the day and somebody would take it before then, or even offer to pay more than the asking rental and still not get it because they decided, oh no, we're going to give it to somebody that's on a higher income. And for some of these countries where the rental market is just, like I said, completely dysfunctional, rents are going up by a couple of $100 a year, and it's just almost impossible sometimes to find a rental property, then yeah, like being evicted with a month's notice would be a crisis. And there's a good chance you could end up homeless or having to work with the government or local council to even be housed. So I can understand how someone might jump to some of those conclusions, but that is very much not what is happening here. And I think Oklahoma and the US in general does have a less regulated and therefore a bit more of a smooth running rental system. But thank you for that news and for that personal update, Andrew. Moving now to Asia and Eastern Europe, somewhere in the region of 1 million people have died in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so, of course, this is a massive ongoing conflict, something that so many people would like to see the end of. A lot of our news revolves around watching that wind down, people hoping it's going to wind down. We had the ceasefire in energy infrastructure recently. Last week, a lot of the talk has been about a ceasefire in the Black Sea. So to give us an update on what's going on with those ceasefires and that conflict, we'll go to our Asia correspondent, Jeremiah Jacques.
It has been more than a week now since Russian President Vladimir Putin really rejected the full ceasefire plan that Ukraine had agreed to. But he did agree to a partial ceasefire, as you said, basically covering energy and infrastructure. But in the days since, Putin's forces have hit energy and other civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals and schools in cities across Ukraine. And actually, Russia's bombardment of these kinds of targets has increased during this time. They fired more than 1,000 long-range drones, and there have been numerous Ukrainian civilian casualties as a result of this. Putin also said just yesterday that despite Trump pushing this ceasefire, that he will be able to, quote, finish them off, referring to Ukraine. So he plans now to finish them off completely. It's not clear how he would conquer the whole country, but he's really spitting in President Trump's face there, just saying, peace plan be hanged, we'll take it all. Meanwhile, Ukraine also made another incursion into Russia in recent days. So the ceasefire that President Trump has worked so hard to broker has really descended fully into farcical territory at this point. There was also a 12-hour meeting this week between some of President Trump's officials and a delegation of Russians. And the U.S. came out of this meeting saying that the result was a new deal securing some peace in the Black Sea, basically limiting hostilities in that area. So that sounded like some progress towards some, at least, temporary peace over one area. But then Mr. Trump admitted Wednesday that Putin seems to be dragging his feet on some aspects of that narrow deal and on the overall peace process as well. So it seems like Putin is determined to try to improve Russia's position on the battlefield as much as possible before he'll enter into any kind of real talks about pausing hostilities. And then Putin has also said that he wants the sanctions on Russia lifted, particularly in the agricultural sector. And he's demanding that Russia be able to go back to using the SWIFT global banking system without any complications. Now, President Trump, for his part, he seems eager to give in to these Russian demands, but there's one party that is not amenable to them, and that is Europe. The Europeans don't want to go back to business as usual with Russia, even if the Trump administration does. So on Wednesday, EU leaders rejected those Russian demands. They said the restrictions on Russia will stay in place until Russia pulls fully out of Ukraine. And they reiterated what a wicked war this has been, and they ascribed the blame squarely to Russia. So peace remains elusive, terribly elusive. And it's hard to see how Mr. Trump will be able to get it solved if Russia's demands remain in place, especially in a way that doesn't just encourage more acts of aggression from Russia and its allies. And really, a lot of the underlying problems here are explained by something that Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry covered in our last Philadelphia Trumpet issue. He wrote in there that President Trump has some serious imbalances and problems in his thinking about how to bring about peace. One part of Mr. Flurry's article says Mr. Trump has, quote, a serious blind spot when it comes to peace negotiation and international diplomacy. And then he says that what Mr. Trump has is a, quote, deadly weakness. Mr. Flurry explains that this is basically because Trump thinks that appeasement will work with men like Putin. And he thinks that Russia doesn't really need to be held accountable for its vicious war crimes. So Mr. Flurry emphasizes that all of this is just very worrying and troubling even to see from the U.S. president. And Mr. Flurry goes on from there to discuss a Bible passage in Isaiah 33. It's Isaiah 33, verse 7, and it says, the ambassadors of peace shall weep bitterly. And Mr. Flurry says that is the outcome of our misguided peace efforts for mankind's entire tragic history. We have proved that we do not know the way of peace. Only God does, end quote. So this article is a very powerful, just a scathing condemnation of a lot of what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. If anyone would like to check that out, it's called Does Donald Trump Know the Way to Peace?
Thank you very much for that succinct report, Jeremiah. And I do have a bit more that I wanted to say on the way of peace, or something I wanted to play from Mr. Armstrong about the way of peace. I'll save that for the very end, though. So stick around to get some of his analysis. I think this was him even while he was on a tour of the Middle East, actually actively talking and working and sitting down with many of these world leaders involved in conflict. But before we get to that, Jeremiah, do you want to give us just a rundown of some of the other important bits of news in Asia?
Yes, sure. First up, a story about purges in the Chinese military, which one China expert says may be among the most dangerous developments in the world today. So this is about some top brass, some very high-ranking leaders of China's People's Liberation Army, including third in command, General He Weidong, and they have all allegedly been detained earlier this month and have not appeared publicly ever since, including at some notable events where their absence was very unusual. So their disappearances are believed to be part of the Chinese Communist Party's overall military purge that has been underway for more than a decade now, with thousands of officials being removed from power by Secretary General Xi Jinping. And many of these individuals are never seen or heard from again. But if He Weidong, who is a longtime Xi loyalist, has now been added to the list, then this could mark a new phase in this trend. So it could mean that now some of the factions within the Chinese Communist Party who are against Xi Jinping are causing some of his loyalists and his devotees to be purged. And that could really prompt some aggression from him. I think if Chairman Xi perceives that his power is coming under threat, then we should watch for him to become even more aggressive on the global stage. And then one final story here about China as well, and that is that China has been designated the #1 military and cyber threat to the United States by America's annual threat assessment. So many had feared that we might find, Canada at the top of the list this year, or maybe Denmark, or who knows, Costa Rica. In the current climate, it feels like anything is possible. But no, it was China, very deservingly topping the list of the main military and cyber threats to America. So that's reassuring to see. And this new assessment highlights China's ability to target America with its top-tier array of missiles. It also points to China's capacity to disrupt U.S. infrastructure with cyber attacks. And it talks about China's ability to take out U.S. satellites, an area where America is amazingly vulnerable. So China's capabilities in all these areas are growing rapidly as the Chinese prepare to attack first U.S. partners and then eventually America itself. So it is a sobering assessment, and it makes you think that the United States might be either wanting to shore up its alliances or turning to God to be able to, meet this very serious threat from China. But neither of those are happening. Instead, we just see deepening divisions that really make the Chinese threat that much more foreboding.
Thank you for that, Jeremiah. Well, clearly the Ukraine crisis is not solved, but is Gaza? Are we seeing an Arab Spring in Gaza? This week, the headlines have been full of reports of mass protests across Gaza, the citizens of Gaza rising up against Hamas. And this is what people have wanted for well over a year now, even longer, before October 7th. The people of Gaza to make their voices heard, that they're fed up of the genocidal, dictatorial reign of Hamas. They're going to overthrow their overlords and will now have a peaceful, democratic Gaza that can live in harmony with Israel. That's the very optimistic picture that you're getting from some sources. I'm here now with Mihailo Zekic to give you the real picture.
Yeah, so to fill in a little more of those details, for the past several days now, there's been reports of hundreds morphing into thousands of people marching throughout Gaza, which of course is a small territory to begin with, but includes Gaza City, another town to the north called Beit Lahia, which, according to estimates, one protest there Wednesday was marked as 3,000 people. But you could see from some of the footage either way, even if the numbers might be a bit exaggerated, that is still quite a big following coming into these protests, with also people openly talking about Hamas. We want to end your rule, like people holding up anti-Hamas signs. Hamas is in a bit of a difficult position right now because Israel started their ground invasion. If they start sending troops to go in and stop the protests, that lets Israel know immediately where all these people are and where they're coming from, etc. And it also makes them look bad and less much of, the resistance group that they want to portray themselves as.
Right, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. That for Hamas, usually they just hide when Israel invades with some ambushes and things. And you can't put down a protest by force and keep your troops hidden at the same time.
Exactly. So this is backing them up into a corner and also giving Israel a little bit of, I guess you could say, moral justification. Like, look, they want Hamas gone. We need to go and remove them. Or you have to remember those same people, I don't know if it's the same individuals, but the same Gazan people that we're seeing in these so-called thousands coming in to call for Hamas's rule to end are also the same people that were jeering around all those people kidnapped on October 7th being brought in, and the same people that were celebrating with Hamas when the ceasefire was announced in January. So it is very much a product of the circumstances on the ground, I'd interpret at least, rather than a mass change of heart. If it was a change of heart, you'd be seeing hostages released by their civilian quote-unquote captors of their own volition, or more tip-offs given, or whatever, but you're not really seeing that.
So some important points. I think one important question is about the scale of these protests. I mean, you mentioned 3,000. We've got some numbers. Is this enough of an uprising to pose a real threat to Hamas?
Well, Hamas has roughly 2 million people. The population is supposedly increasing even after the war. So 3,000 compared to however many thousands of soldiers Hamas has, the numbers are a little bit murky for obvious reasons. That's not going to do much. And also, like, even if they do remove Hamas somehow, which is not going to happen, again, with how much military infrastructure they have, the people that are going to replace them, whoever they are, they're still cut from the same cloth.
Right. I want to get to in a minute. Mm-hmm. But do these protesters represent, do you think, the majority opinion within Gaza?
Probably majority of what everybody's thinking. I wouldn't say the majority of what everybody's willing to do.
So they reflect majority opinion, but these are a group that are unusually motivated.
Yes.
Other people may well support them, but they're not willing to put their own necks on the line.
Exactly.
And then I think that does bring me to the next question is, what is their beef with Hamas? What precisely do they disagree with? And I think what you've explained so far is they don't like being under fire. So how would a regime run by these protesters be different? Would it be less aggressively against Israel because it doesn't want to feel the consequences of an Israeli strike? You know, how different would it be from Hamas?
Well, I think you have to realize these protesters, they're not marching under a banner for or political organization or whatever. They're just trying to pressure Hamas to release the hostages and get another ceasefire going. And they said as much. There is no, I guess you could say, prominent movement leaders or this political party structure.
And I think there's a couple of points that are always important to keep in mind watching any mass protest. One is there is a very strong tendency among Western journalists and politicians to superimpose their own beliefs on the protesters. I think we saw this most notably in the Arab Spring, where the protesters were protesting against Hosni Mubarak. And in the West, we love democracy and free speech and free markets, etc. So it was assumed that these protesters were also protesting in favor of those same values. The other thing that's important to remember is that generally all protest movements are coalitions. They're groups of people that disagree with the status quo, but there's one status quo. There are a great many alternatives to the status quo, and often those protesters won't be advocating for the same alternative. And so if you're a Western journalist, you can go and find someone in the protest movement that agrees with you and interview him and amplify this message. That's what we saw with the Arab Spring in Egypt. You could find a minority of protesters that spoke English, that had received a Western-style education and agreed with that view. The majority, though, wanted a Muslim theocracy. So I think those are important pieces of context whenever you're watching any protest movement anywhere in the world. In terms of what we're expecting from Gaza, we also have specific Bible prophecies to guide us. So perhaps you can take us through what we're expecting to happen next.
Yes, the main prophecy would be in Psalm 83, which discusses various groups of Middle Eastern peoples coming together to attack Israel. The particular peoples are never mentioned in the Bible or in secular history as forming an alliance to attack the people of Israel, which is why Trumpet Editor-in-Chief, Mr. Gerald Flurry, has labeled this as a prophecy. Verses 6 to 8 detail this alliance, and it reads, quote, "The tabernacles of Edom and of the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre, Asher also is joined with them," end quote. A lot of names. Doesn't really make much sense unless you know who the ancestors or the descendants of those peoples are. And Mr. Flurry has a whole book, The King of the South, that talks about who is what. But what I like to focus on in there is the Philistines, which were anciently based in Gaza. Gaza was one of the original Philistine cities that was fighting against the Israelites in ancient times. And Mr. Flurry points to that being a sign of the modern Palestinian Arabs, especially those in the Gaza Strip. And another one I will just mention, Asher there, that's an ancient name for Germany. So we're expecting the Palestinians, the people living in the Gaza Strip, to come together under an alliance with other Middle Eastern peoples as led by Germany. What exactly is this alliance going to want to do? Verses 3 to 4 detail exactly what they're doing. quote, "They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted against your hidden ones. They have said, 'Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance.'" This same attitude, the same attitude that inspired Hamas to do what it did on October 7th, to do what it's still doing now, that's still going to be the motivating factor of whatever state the Palestinians in Gaza end up finding themselves in. And you could look through, again, the King of the South explains a lot of this. A lot of these other countries mentioned, like Jordan, the Gulf states, those look maybe more on paper, more moderate countries. Some of them already have relations with Israel. Whatever happens in Gaza, whether it's an American protectorate or a new autonomous country or whatever, they're lumped in there with them. Israel might look at that and think, okay, maybe the Palestinians are having a change of heart. They're not siding with Iran. They're not siding with some of these other radical countries, which prophecy labels in another block. But that doesn't mean the attitudes are changing. That doesn't mean that there's a change of heart. That doesn't mean that the people on the ground, whoever replaces Hamas as the leadership in Gaza, have any different goals than what Hamas wants when push comes to shove. And there's a lot that has to be fulfilled with that, but regardless of whatever happens, that's still going to be the motivating factor of who takes control of Gaza, regardless of what kind of outside show they put on.
An important perspective, and I think you can analyze the facts on the ground, and I think say pretty clearly that this protest does not mean a complete change of heart for the inhabitants of Gaza, but the Bible gives us an even more specific warning, and a specific warning about what is going to happen to Israel. And I think ties into some of what we were talking about with Jeremiah, about how mankind just doesn't know the way of peace, and people will look at even democracy and spreading that as a means to produce peace. And that's not going to be a solution for what is happening in Gaza. I want to talk about some of that a little bit more in a moment, play you just one more quick clip on that. But do you want to give us just a very brief rundown of some of the other news from the Middle East?
Yes, in Israel, there's been a lot of rumblings of reforms on the justice system there. The Israeli cabinet voted to fire Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara, who was appointed by the previous government before Netanyahu. She is independent of the actual coalition, a bit more of an autonomous person that can make judicial rulings similar to the Supreme Court, as we talked about in this program, that don't necessarily have any legal standing based on the laws on the books, but are really meant to get in the way of the Prime Minister's agenda. Later this week, the Knesset passed Netanyahu's judicial reform bill. It's a lot more moderate than what he was originally planning. This time, the way the Israeli justice system works is that Supreme Court justices are appointed by a nonpartisan committee, but they often have their own agenda. This time, the government has a bit more say on who's part of that committee. There's characteristic protests on the street in Israel against this, but you are seeing Netanyahu tighten up some of these loose ends that have been causing him so many problems, especially with judicial activism. One other story from Iran, there are reports suggesting that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is willing to start nuclear negotiations indirectly with the United States. We talked on a few programs back on President Trump and the United States offering an olive branch to get nuclear negotiations started. It looks like the Iranians are warming up to it in a very roundabout way. But one way or another, if both parties are interested in it, we're probably going to be hearing a lot more about this very soon.
Thank you very much for that, Mihailo. I just wanted to finish the show off with a little bit of an excerpt from a 1981 World Tomorrow show that showcased some of what Mr. Armstrong was traveling around the Middle East and talking to various different leaders about. We've had a lot on this show about peace, about America trusting Europe to help bring peace to the world, negotiations with Ukraine for peace. Will these protests in Gaza lead to peace? And Mr. Armstrong spent a lot of time talking very fundamentally about why we can't have peace and what is the way to peace. And really, all of these different events that we're talking about, they are leading to peace. Now, if we stubbornly refuse to obey God and go our own way, yeah, that's going to lead to war. But God is even using that to help us to learn the lessons that we need to, so that we realize our ineffectiveness at bringing peace ourselves and turn to Him. So this is what Mr. Armstrong said.
I'm not going to speak to you very long tonight, but I'm going to speak plainly, because the time has come for very plain speaking, and I've come a long way to bring you this message. And today we stand, if you pardon my giving you the bad news first, we stand on the very brink of human extinction. Conditions in the world are constantly growing worse, and the weapons now exist of mass destruction that can annihilate all human life from this planet. Now, in all human history, they have never invented a new weapon of mass destruction that has not been used. There is a cause for every effect, and we're in a very bad effect today. And in this world, we've been accustomed to treating with effects and ignoring the causes. And you can never get rid of an effect until you cure the cause. And it's time we learn why. What brought us to this kind of position in the world? Knowledge doubled in the decade of the 60s, but also world's troubles doubled. Troubles that man has been unable to solve or to cure. In the 70s, knowledge doubled again. But again, our troubles doubled. Now, the increased knowledge didn't cause the increased trouble. But on the other hand, the increased knowledge did not solve our troubles. And we still have our troubles. Such things as peace, which we don't have. We work for peace, we fight for peace. Yes, and there are wars constantly going on. There's one in the Middle East right now. But peace and happiness, contentment and joy, and abundant well-being that is universal for all of us, those are spiritual qualities. They're not physical qualities, they're spiritual. And we don't seem to realize that. There is a basic spiritual law, and it is in motion. That law could be stated as the principle of outgoing love toward others. I simplify it by calling it the way of give. Now, that is the way of cooperation instead of competition. It is the way of helping, of serving. I simplify it by calling that the way of give, because people can understand that word so well. But the opposite, the transgression of that way, is the way of get. And that's the way this world is living. This world is living the way of get. I love me, and I don't care about you except what I can get from you or take away from you. So the get way is the way of vanity, trying to exalt ourselves, the way of coveting, of lust and greed, the way of envy and jealousy toward others, the way of competition and strife that leads to violence and war.
So peace then comes from living the way of give as opposed to the way of get. And very soon we're heading for a new world where everybody lives the way of give, and we have peace on just every level. Peace within families, peace within nations, peace between nations. All of these different news stories that we're talking about are leading to that wonderful world tomorrow. Well, that's about it from us. Thank you so much for listening. You can leave us a comment. You can get in touch. You can email your thoughts to Andrew about his house burning down or anything like that at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com, or leave us a comment on YouTube. Thank you very much to George Haddad, Isaac Lorenz, and Victor Granados for engineering and production. We'll be back with our regular show on Wednesday. Until then, keep watching your world.